So I thought that I would make a philosophy psychology video today since I haven't made one in a while. And despite the fact that I put on makeup and washed my hair, I'm actually not in a good mood today. And so I thought that the topic that I would choose for this video would be, why is life so hard? And, I have to just kind of level with you at the outset and say that ever since I was a very, very little girl, I've suffered from clinical depression. I know everybody gets depressed sometimes, but I'm talking about pretty hardcore diagnosable clinical depression, and it runs in my family. I have a close family member who had to be hospitalized for a period of time a couple of years ago. It's just something in the head. And not improved by the fact that there was problems, when I was growing up with a father who was NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, and a lot of stuff there. Anyway, my point is that I want to say this at the outset because I feel like there's always a number of people who are resistant to a video like this. I'm not sure why, but for some people, this kind of video is irritating because I know people who think that it's almost wrong to say that life is difficult or sorrowful or unhappy because you're just complaining or you're just wallowing, or well, look at you, you're a fairly nice looking woman living in America, with you have enough to eat, you have all your needs met, you have people who love you. What do you have to complain about? But it's not about that. No matter how great someone's life is still, I'm sorry, but it's still very hard. And it has its moments of beauty and joy, but it also has just a lot of pain. And, I understand that part of my outlook on that is informed by the fact that I have clinical depression. And, for those of you who don't know the difference between just normal depression and feeling sad and feeling legitimately sad about life and actually clinical depression, let me just give you one example. The biggest aspect of depression that I suffer with is something called anhedonia. Hedonia, as in like hedonism, the ability to feel pleasure or happiness. Well, anhedonia, the inability or the difficulty in feeling pleasure or happiness. And the way that I've described it to people before is, do you know that feeling that you get when you're doing something very tedious and very empty and unpleasant? Like say you have to stand in line at the DMV to get your license renewed, at least for my American viewers. You have to stand in line and say it's a really long line and you have to stand there, for hours. That feeling, that empty, bored, like I'm about to jump out of my skin because this is just sort of feeling, that is actually what I feel most of the time. Most of my day, every day feels like that. And it doesn't matter what I'm doing, generally speaking. I can find an escape in watching movies that I love. So it's one reason why I'm such a film fanatic, is because when I'm really engaged in a movie, then I get a brief escape from that feeling, or that lack of feeling, that anhedonia, that depression. And there's some other things, right? But basically that feeling is almost always there. And so even if I'm doing something fun, even if I am out with my friends and we're having drinks at a bar and we're celebrating or whatever, I still feel like I'm standing in line at the DMV. And if you really think about what that's like, it's not a fun way to live. Sorry. So anyway, I'm just having a bad day today. I'll be fine, right? But so I thought I'd make this video, okay, and talk about life, because look, whether you're depressed or you're not depressed or whatever, okay, life, it's hard, and that's not to say it doesn't have a lot of beauty. That's not to say that it doesn't have a lot of meaning. In fact, some of you know that until recently, I was a professor, English professor for many years, and I may be again, but anyway, I got let go because they let everybody in my position go. Long story, they didn't fire me or anything, but anyway, where was I going with that? But one of the things that I talk about a lot in my classes is that a meaningful life does not necessarily entail a happy life. And in fact, if you look at the world's major religions, and, I'm a theist. I believe in God. I believe in a God who is, to some degrees, actively involved in the world. But I don't subscribe to any particular religion. I was raised Christian, still have a lot of respect for that tradition, that belief. But if you look at all of the world's major religions, what you find is that none of them place emphasis on happiness as a legitimate goal in life. Now, they do place an emphasis on peace, on finding peace and on finding joy, but that is very different than what we think of as happiness or pleasure. And so one of the things that you have to understand about life is that even though it has a lot of wonderful things, eventually, and you all know this in my audience, eventually it's going to come along, no matter how careful you are, no matter how much you plan everything out or whatever, it's going to come along and it's going to hit you in the fucking stomach at some point. It's going to sucker punch you. And this comes in many different forms, right? It can be everything from health problems to financial problems to breakups, to you name it, losing loved ones, disappointments, whatever. I've gone through a few things in my life. I would say the most significant, like I said, like I've said before, I was raised by an NPD father. There was, a lot of psychological and emotional abuse, and my mom during that period was not happy, and so there was, she had some issues on her end, too, because of that, in terms of the way that she related to us, to her children. And then in my 20s, I dated a man seriously for 4 years, and envisioned that I would have a lot longer with him. And then he turned out he had terminal lung cancer, and he went from being seemingly very healthy to being dead within 10 months. And that was when I was in my late 20s. I took care of him. I was his primary caretaker, and that was I'm so glad I was there to be able to help him through that. That was a really difficult experience. And then, like I said, this depression thing, which has just been the albatross around my neck all these years, because even when I'm supposed to be happy, even when things are going well, a lot of the times I don't feel good. And so anyway, my point is, why I say all that is just to say that even someone like me, who I feel like I have such a blessed life, I have so many advantages, I've been dealt such a great hand, okay? But even me, I've struggled a lot. Everybody struggles. I don't care who you are. I don't care how on top of the world these celebrities you look at or whatever. Most of the time, their money and success, it doesn't even give them the happiness. It doesn't give them the happiness you think it would. So here's the question then, all right? Does suffering negate meaning? That is to say that because let me just say one more thing too, okay? To people who say, well, yeah, life has suffering and whatever, but come on, the good outweighs the bad. Well, I'm not so sure about that, okay? And let me tell you 2 reasons why I'm not so sure about that. Okay, and I'm not talking about meaning here, and I'm not talking about God or anything, right? I'm going to get to that. I believe in meaning. I believe in God. I'm just talking about, though, if we just were to try to just objectively, without knowing the higher purpose of everything, if we were just to objectively weigh out the good versus the bad, I'm not sure that the good outweighs the bad. So let me introduce you to one philosopher that a number of you are probably going to hate, okay, and very controversial, all right? But there's this guy the South African philosopher named David Benatar. And one of his famous books is entitled Better Never to Have Been Born. Better Never to Have Been Born. And it's a kind of a takeoff on an old saying by a classical philosopher. I believe it was Socrates. If I'm wrong, you can correct me in the comments. But he said something like the greatest gift in life is to never have been born. Which is, kind of a joke, but what it's saying is that, life in the balance, the good versus the bad, it's not so great. And Benatar is a proponent of a philosophy known as anti-natalism. Natal, as in like baby, right? So there's like the neonatal unit at hospitals or whatever, right? Well, antinatalism is the philosophy that it is immoral to have children, because when you have children, you are bringing them into a life that on the whole is going to be more pain and suffering and discomfort and disappointment than the good stuff. And this is what Benatar said. And so we're not, by the way, we're not just talking about abortion, okay? Yes, an antinatalist would believe that abortion would be a better thing than bringing a child into this world. But even before you would get to conception, like Benatar just says, whether it's abortion or non-abortion or whatever, we shouldn't be having children. He says, he and others who are antinatalists believe that life, that it's a selfish thing to have a child, because most people who are having children, they're not having children for that child. They're having children for themselves, right? Okay. And again, don't get mad at me. I'm just introducing some stuff to you, and believe me, we're not going to stay fixated on this. We're going to move on to some stuff that's more optimistic and meaningful and everything. But it's important to have the guts and to have the strength to stare these things in the face. And I tell you, I do get irritated sometimes. I don't get irritated with people who are happy. And I don't get irritated with people who are in a good mood, or people who think that life is wonderful or whatever. But what I do get irritated with is people who say that it is wrong to admit that life has suffering and is difficult, and that maybe on the whole, it is more bad than good. I mean, look, in the Bible, Jesus was called, the New Testament calls Jesus a man of sorrows. And if you look at the world's major religions, what you see is that they acknowledge, they embrace the fact that life is shitty. So before you get mad at me for bringing us down with some negative stuff, let me just say that if you look at the history and tradition of religions and of philosophy and so forth, you would find that the great theologians and prophets and religious leaders and the great philosophers and the great psychoanalysts would agree with me in some of the stuff I'm saying. Now, so back to this Benatar guy, though, all right? And again, I'm starting with like the most sort of cynical or negative perspective, and then we're gonna move out of that and look at some other stuff. But Benatar and the antinatalists say, look, think about your typical day. Think about your day. Okay, so you wake up in the morning. Now, the first thing for a lot of people when they wake up is they've got to pee, right? And if you're like me, you play this game with yourself where like you don't want to get out of bed because you're still half asleep, and you don't want to have to like actually like wake up and go to the bathroom and pee, and so you like try to stay in bed as long as you can, but then like your bladder starts like anyway. The point is, Benatar says, you immediately, the first thing you're aware of when you wake up is that you are in a dissatisfied state of being. Right? Why are you dissatisfied? You're dissatisfied because you need to pee. You're dissatisfied because maybe you didn't get enough sleep the night before. And then what else do you need to do? You've got to eat, right? So you've got that hunger. You're in a state of mild discomfort until you eat. All right. And then think of what your day typically is. It's a lot of monotonous tasks. All right. The French philosopher Albert Camus talks about this in the great work, The Myth of Sisyphus. He basically says that life is like the myth of Sisyphus. And if you know your philosophy, you know that Sisyphus was this guy who was condemned by the gods for eternity to roll a boulder up a hill, this huge, heavy boulder, right? And Sisyphus would have to roll it. Oh, he's sweating and straining and using all of his strength to finally roll this thing up the hill. And then what would happen? It would, every time, as soon as he got it to the top of the hill, it would roll down on him, and it would roll back down. And what would he have to do? He would have to roll it up again. And that the gods condemned Sisyphus to do this for eternity. He would have to, this pointless, monotonous, meaningless act, and that was his life for eternity. Now, Camus says, in a way, that's kind of like human life. Think of how much of your days, how much of your life is filled with just really just monotonous activities. So you get up, you've got to pee, then you've got to get some kind of breakfast, and you've got to take a shower, and you've got to get your stuff together, and then you've got to take the kids to school, and then you've got to, sit in rush hour traffic or whatever, and then you go to work, and then you've got to do a lot of, even if you like your job, there's a lot lot of like monotonous, boring, stressful tasks and people you have to deal with that you don't want to. And then, you have to eat throughout the day because you're kind of in discomfort because maybe you don't like sitting hunched over a desk all day. And I mean, basically the point that Benatar, Camus to a degree too, but Benatar makes, is that we are pretty much almost always in a state of discomfort. Right? So, you get up in the morning, you've got to pee and you've got to eat, and then you've got to eat later again, and then you've got back pain, and then you've got the stress, and then you've got all these monotonous tasks, and then you've got to eat again, and then you've got to sleep, but maybe you have insomnia and you can't sleep, so you feel tired the next day, and then you've got your mother-in-law calling you, and you've got this and that. And then basically, Benatar says if we were really honest with ourselves, we would admit that most of our time is spent, a great deal of our time is spent in states of varying degrees of discomfort or need, okay, that we're always trying to satiate or fill, even if it's just pissing in the morning. And then Benatar says also, there's the fact that the great pain and suffering of the world is not matched by the great pleasures of the world. In other words, Benatar suggests that you do this little thought exercise, okay? Imagine the greatest human pleasure that you can imagine, right? So like imagine, an amazing sexual encounter, or imagine, just like the best piece of chocolate cake, or imagine, whatever your thing is, whatever like pleasure for you or happiness is. For me, it would be an amazing movie that I'm really absorbed in, right? And then Benatar says, imagine the worst pain that you could imagine. So we're talking like Grand Inquisition stuff. We're talking about getting, flayed alive, or we're talking about terminal cancer that's not being well controlled by pain medication, or whatever. Now, this is what Benatar asks. He says, would you experience, or no, how does he say it? He says, now, compare these two things. Compare the most amazing pleasure that you can imagine that is available to humans and the worst pain, okay? Would you go through an hour or a day of the worst pain to get to the best pleasure? In other words, would you let someone torture you for an hour so that then you could enjoy a piece of chocolate cake or some great sex for an hour? Would you let someone torture you for a day so that then you could have a day of great chocolate cake or great sex or whatever? No, of course you wouldn't. And Benatar says that's exactly the point, is that the pleasure and the pain, they don't match up. The pain is worse. It's worse. Now, I understand a number of you saying, well, that's a simplistic way of looking at the world, and I don't agree with that, and so forth. Okay, sure. Fine. And look, that's not where I'm leaving it either. But I'm just saying, let's be real. Let's be real about the fact that there are certainly legitimate reasons to feel like life sucks, and that everything's not okay. All right, that Bob Marley song, every little thing's going to be all right. Well, really? Okay. Well, given that opinion, right? Where do we go from there? Well, I think that, one of the books that I really want to get into in a future episode, and I'm planning on getting into it, it's a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and it's by a man named Viktor Frankl. Some of you have read this book. It's a really famous book. There was this guy, Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, Jewish psychiatrist, and he was imprisoned at Auschwitz. So he was imprisoned at several concentration camps by the Nazis. And he lost his entire family. His pregnant wife and his parents died in the Holocaust. And Frankl wrote a book when he was released from Auschwitz. He wrote a book about suffering and about how to find meaning in life, even despite the suffering or even through and because of suffering. And Frankl's thesis was that his thesis was twofold. First of all, he says that happiness is not a legitimate goal in life. Happiness, and so when you ask most people, like, what's your goal in life? And they'll say, well, I just want to be happy. I just want to be happy, right? It kind of reminds me of, so back when I was a professor, occasionally I would have students, college students say this really funny thing to me that I never understood. Oh, I don't know if I like what my hair is doing. Okay. Occasionally, I would have students say this thing to me that I never understood. They would say, we'd be talking about their assignment, their paper, and they would be basically like trying to encourage me to give them as good a grade as possible. And a few of them would say, Doctor, my name, Doctor, all I need is an A. All I need is an A. Oh, okay. All you need is the highest grade possible. Gotcha. No problem there. I never understood that. But I had several students who would say that to me. All I need is an A. So the point is, all I want is to be happy. Well, that's a pretty tall bill, okay? And Frankl says that the reason why happiness is not a good object or good goal in life is because it is not achievable all of the time. And for a number of people, it may not be achievable even, most of the time. Some people, as we know, there's a lot of people who live, and I'm not talking just about depression now, okay? I'm talking about people who experience from the outside, exterior caused pain and suffering. We all know these stories. Holocaust or something more mundane. Your neighbor down the street who's got ALS. Or someone who lost their son to a pedophile or something horrible like that. I'm sorry that I'm being distracting with my hair. I'm just going to stop. And so anyway, so Frankl says that happiness is not often achievable. And so the question, and also not only is it not achievable, but often there is not much to be learned through pleasure. In other words, when I look back at the times in my life where I learned the most, where I feel like I grew the most psychologically, spiritually, intellectually, or whatever, it was by and large during the times of, I said I wasn't going to fool with it. It was by and large during the times of pain and struggle, which is not to say that, I wish those things would happen again. But I do recognize in retrospect that there was a lot of growth in a lot of ways there. And so Frankl says that rather than our goal being happiness, our goal in life should be meaning. And meaning, he says, Frankl likes to say that meaning, that a search for meaning will often then give happiness or give fulfillment, contentment, joy as a byproduct. He says that Frankl says that happiness is like success. If you go straight for success, right? If you're just trying to be successful and you don't really care what you're doing, it's hard to achieve success, right? But if you find something, like professionally speaking, that you are really passionate about and that you really throw yourself into, then when you find something that gives you a sense of meaning or fulfillment or passion or whatever, then success often comes as a byproduct. Right? And so he says the same thing is true for meaning and happiness. Those who are just mindlessly pursuing lives of happiness often miss it or find disappointment, lack of fulfillment, and lack of meaning. But those who seek to pursue meaning, then they often find something better, something else, happiness, joy, fulfillment as a kind of a byproduct. Now, what does that mean? What does meaning mean? Well, we'll talk about that later, and that may be actually a future episode because, like I said, I want to spend an entire video breaking down Frankl's book because there's so many. If you haven't read the book, or if you have, then there's so many gems in that book. Okay, so we're going to talk about that later. And if you think about like the world's major religions, think about, for instance, the way that I talked about, the way that Jesus is depicted in the Bible, that, like I said, the New Testament calls him a man of sorrow. We don't get a depiction of Jesus in the Bible very often as being happy, per se. And certainly if you look at the way that his life ended, and if you look at the way the lives of his apostles, his disciples went, there's a lot of suffering, a lot of turmoil, a lot of hard work under persecution and threat of persecution and everything, right? And if you just think about, not even thinking about Jesus per se, but just think of what life was like back then during that period, think about what it must have been like before modern medicine. I mean, have you ever thought about what people did in the past when they had all of these, before antibiotics, before, before modern painkillers. And I know people talk a lot about like the opioid crisis and whatever, and there's downsides to everything. But I mean, thank God that when people are in pain, there are things that they can take. And so I know that the poppies have been around for a long time. But my point is that actually the natural condition of humans has been for thousands and millions of years, since our earliest evolution. The state of the world is a lot of pain and a lot of suffering. And look at the animal world, right? People like to say you shouldn't have your cats outside because the lifespan of a cat is so much shorter than when it's outside, because there's so many things that can get it. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that advice. I like my cat to be able to go outside when it wants to, so it's not in jail. But at the same time, what I'm pointing at is that the natural world, the uncivilized world, the animal world, it's got a hell of a lot of pain in it. And if you just think about the cycle of predation, the predatory cycle, right? I mean, we have entire species that are kept alive only because they hunt and kill and, in a way, torture other creatures, right? I mean, just watch the nature show. If you know the poetry of Tennyson, Alfred Lord Tennyson, one of the great poets of the 19th century. And what did he say? He said, nature is red in tooth and claw. Nature is red. Red is in blood. In other words, the nature of nature is bloody, right? It is violent. It is dark. And so when you look at, and for instance, when you look at the world's major religions, think about what is the story of Buddha? Think about Buddhism. What is the story of Buddha? Well, the story of Buddha is that Buddha was originally a prince. And there was a prophecy made when Buddha was born. And the prophecy went like this. The prophet told his parents that if they kept Buddha behind, and Siddhartha Gautama, if they kept him behind the palace gates and they never let him venture outside, then he would become a great king. But if they let him go outside the palace gates, if they let him venture into the world, then he would become a great religious leader. That was the prophecy, supposedly, that was given in his birth. And so his parents were faced with this choice. Do we want our son to live a life of pleasure as a king, right? As a great ruler, a life of power, a life of comfort, a life of eminence, right? Or do we want him to be a religious leader? And think about the way that religious leaders' lives often go, right? They're not about pleasure. They're typically about asceticism. They're typically filled often with a lot of turmoil because religious leaders tend to stir things up and be controversial. Why did Christ get crucified, right? And it's just not, typically being a religious leader is just not the happiest, easiest life. Of course, neither is being a king, generally, for that matter. But here's the point. Buddha's parents, faced with this choice, do we want our son, are we going to shelter our son so that he becomes this great ruler, or are we going to let him go so that he becomes this great religious leader, this prophet? And faced with that choice, they made the decision that most parents would make. They chose for him to be a king, to remain behind. They tried to keep him behind the palace walls. They didn't want him to be some religious leader, right? And that is a kind of a choice of choosing happiness over meaning, because one was the more meaningful route, and the parents didn't want that for him. But what ended up happening, according to the story, right, is that Buddha eventually, when he becomes a young man, he ventures outside the palace and he sees three things that he had never seen before, because remember, he'd been very sheltered inside the palace gates. He sees three things that he had never seen before. He sees a person dying, so he's introduced to the notion of death. I'll talk about that more in a minute. He sees a person, an old person, okay? So the idea of like the body aging and breaking down and not being what it once was. And then he sees a sick person, right? So there's the idea of sickness. And you know what? I might be confusing a little bit. He might have seen poverty too. I feel like I might be conflating the old and the sick part. I can't remember. But anyway, so basically the point is he goes outside the palace gates. I should have prepped before I did this, but like I told you, I'm not really feeling good today. He goes outside the palace gates and he sees, basically he's introduced to several awful realities of the world. And I want to talk about those. Okay, the first is death. Look, there is a perspective, and I know a lot of people don't want to hear it, okay? But there is a perspective that death negates meaning, because think about it. And you know what? Even the book of Ecclesiastes, if you've never read the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, I really recommend it, because I think it's my favorite book, and it is depressing, yes, but it is a book that it is a work of writing that really it has the guts to face the dark side of life. And basically what Ecclesiastes does, what the writer does, is he goes through and he talks about all of these things in life that are supposed to give us happiness, or supposed to give us a sense of meaning and whatever, and how basically they fail us. He says, look, if you pursue money, what you find is that you either lose the money or you die and it has to go to someone else. You know, you love your children, but your children end up leaving you, don't they? And look, I'm not trying to say that having children is not a meaningful thing. I totally believe it is, right? But it is kind of a painful thing, because and I can't imagine feeling this, but it's got to be very painful when you're raising a child and you know that you only have a short span of years, and then that child not only is going to be gone, but they're not going to really have a lot to do with you after they leave. I know, and that's really the truth. I know that some people stay super close to their parents. Like, there are some people who live, right down the street, or people who talk to their parents every day. But the norm is that when the children move out, then the parent will only see that child several times a year, and they'll only hear from them, once a week if they're lucky. But that relationship that they had, that really tight, close knit, seeing them every day, being involved in their lives, having someone to talk to every day, that's gone. It's gone. And so even in children, there is a kind of a disappointment. And then the writer of Ecclesiastes talks about all these other things. Okay, he basically just ticks through all this stuff that he says basically, yeah, I tried this and it didn't end up doing it for me. He says, I tried pleasure, I tried power, I tried sex, I tried children, I tried money, I tried this and that and leisure, whatever, right? And he's like, and so anyway. And one of the big themes in that book, in Ecclesiastes, is that death has a way of negating life. In other words, you spend your life trying to achieve all of these things, and then you die, and it's basically as if it never happened. You mean, you say, what do you mean it never happened? My children are there. Well, yeah, sure. But your children are going to die, and then their children are going to die, and pretty soon there's not going to be anybody who even remembers you. Now, again, I am taking the cynical path here, because there is another side of things, right? And again, we're going to get to that. But I do believe my method of working through these things is that we stare the dark truths in the face, and then we can deal with them, and then we can look at explanations, and we can look at ways of moving beyond that, right? And so anyway, this idea that death, there is a kind of negation with death, that all of, I remember when my boyfriend died. I told you in my 20s, my boyfriend died of cancer, and he was a professor. He was a bit older. He was older than me. I was in my mid-20s and he was in his late 40s. So still very young to die of cancer. And by the way, he got cancer from smoking cigarettes. He was a lifelong smoker, and the doctors told him that the kind of lung cancer that he had was a lung cancer that they only see in smokers, and it's the deadliest. That it has basically a less than 1% survival rate. So don't smoke cigarettes. Tobacco is so bad for you. Weed is different, but tobacco, And one day I'll do a video on weed and I'll explain to you why it is different. But it is. There have been a huge study that was done several years ago on marijuana, and they were trying to find a link, and they fully expected to find a link between marijuana and lung disease and lung cancer. And so it was the biggest study of its time that had been done. It was thousands of people, and really well done study, tightly controlled and everything. So they looked at 3 different groups. They looked at the group that a control group that didn't smoke cigarettes or smoke weed. Then they looked at a group that smoked cigarettes and weed, and then they looked at a group that only smoked weed. And they tracked these people. And so anyway, the point is, what they found is that the people who smoked cigarettes had the expected increase in lung cancer and serious lung disease. So, which we would expect, because we know tobacco causes lung cancer. And by the way, more women die of lung cancer every year than die of breast cancer. The only reason you don't hear about it more is because the lung cancer kills people. So there are no survivors to wear the pretty ribbons or whatever, right? But lung cancer does kill more than breast cancer. Anyway, where am I going with that? I'm just full of all kinds of happy news today, so I'm sure y'all loving this video. But anyway, so they looked at so the tobacco people got a much higher incidence of cancer. What they found, though, was that not only was there no increase in the weed-only group, there was no increase between the control group and the weed group, but they found that for those who smoked the most weed, for heavy consumers of weed, they actually had less lung cancer than the people who didn't smoke weed. That there actually seemed to be a kind of a strange protective effect that smoking the weed had on the on smokers. Now, I'm not saying that everybody needs to go out and start smoking weed or whatever, but I'm just saying that. Look at the research. You're going to find that the best reputable studies show no link at all between lung cancer, lung issues, and weed. Anyway, but where was I going with all of that? God, I can't even remember. Okay, I was talking about my ex-boyfriend who died. Anyway, the point is that so we found out that he was sick. How it was diagnosed is he had back pain, and the back pain, at first he ignored it because he was a really tough guy. That's one of the things too that made it really sad, is that he was so full of energy and always had stuff that he was working on or whatever, and really had a zest for life. Unlike me, not a depressive person, really had a zest for life or whatever. And so anyway, he just ignored it, but it got worse. And so he went to the doctor. He went to his primary care physician, and he said, I might need to see a back guy. I think I've got a slip disc or something or whatever. And the guy felt his back and immediately knew that it was tumors. He said, no, it's more serious than that. You need to go to an oncologist. And my boyfriend went to an oncologist, and he found out, a few days later, that he had 10 months to live. And he died pretty much 10 months to the day. That was a very accurate. I think the guy told him that he had somewhere around 9 or 10 months to live, and he died 10 months later. And it was a very quick descent. And those of you who've seen the process of death and all of that, I mean, it's like a horror show. It's like a horror show. So I remember that after he died, I went into his office at school, at the college where he worked, and I went into and he had always been such an overachiever. I mean, he had all these books that he had published and all of this stuff. And I remember I went to his office, and I was just looking at all of this stuff that he had just left there. He hadn't picked up his office. It was just the stuff he was typing up, and books stacked up, and notes, and I was just really hit at that moment with a real sense of futility. What was the point of all of this? And look, you can't live life that way. I wouldn't make these YouTube videos if I thought there was no point in anything. I'm just trying to describe for you a mood that I was having at the time, and that I do have at times. And what I'm trying to say to you is that, look, if you feel this way, you don't let people tell you that there's something wrong with you for feeling this way, or don't let people try to tell you that you're just being a Debbie Downer. Okay, no, this world it's fucked up. And every major philosopher, every major religious figure, and every major psychoanalyst has recognized that. And not to mention all the poets and the writers and everything, right? So the question is then, when we look at the state of the world, is there more than just this futility? Is there more than just this sense that it doesn't matter? And that's really what I want to start getting into with these upcoming videos. Okay. So I want to preview for you just a little bit of what I'm going to be getting into in my next couple of philosophy videos, where I want to delve more into this question of the meaning of life and suffering and all of that, and look at different perspectives by famous philosophers and theologians and religious figures and psychoanalysts and so forth, okay? But let me just think about a few things. One idea that comes up a lot in philosophy and psychology and religion and aesthetics and whatever is that there does seem to be a dynamic, there does seem to be almost a kind of a law of the universe in a way, that you cannot have good without bad. You cannot have light without dark. And you might say, well, that's a really kind of like trivial, obvious, simplistic idea. But I really want you to think about this in a deeper sense, okay? We experience life, we understand things in terms of differentiation, all right? Think about like sun versus moon, male versus female, all right? We tend to think light versus dark. We tend to, God versus Satan, if you're in the Christian tradition, heaven versus hell, right? These things, we tend to think about things in terms of bifurcated, dichotomous, di meaning two, categories, all right? And I would argue that there is a reason for that goes beyond just merely that's just the way that humans think of things. And I would argue, and I'm not the only one, that when we look at the nature of life and the universe and existence, it does seem to be that there is a kind of relationship between opposites, okay? If we go with if we're going to, for instance, if you think about the idea that is very common in more Eastern conceptions of the world, and the idea that everything is one, right? The idea that actually everything is one thing and that actually everything emanates from a single source, whether it, be God or what have you. Well, that would mean then that the bad, the darkness or the evil would have to ultimately emanate from God as well. All right? Think about it. Let's go with the Christian tradition, okay? Since that's what a lot of my viewers are familiar with. According to the Christian tradition, who created Satan? Who created Satan? Was Satan self-created? God created Satan. Now, God, according to the Christian tradition, God is all-knowing and all-powerful. So God knew when God created, and I don't actually believe this stuff because I told you I'm not a Christian, but we're just going with it, right? As a metaphor, or for those of you who believe, as reality. So God created Satan. He created this being that he knew would bring evil into the world and would basically destroy things for humanity. He created this being knowing that it was going to unleash evil. So God created evil. There's no other way to look at it. All right? And if you think about the story of Genesis, I think it's really interesting if you think about it. Okay, what does God do in the story of Genesis? He creates this wonderful paradise, and he creates these two human beings, Adam and Eve, and he gives them this wonderful life where there's no pain, no problems, no nothing, right? It's perfection. It's like we think of heaven, okay? And what does he do? He says, hey, you can have all of this, but there's just one thing you can't do. Just one thing. There's this tree, the tree of knowledge, and you can't eat from it. But hey, you can do everything else, Everything else is on the table. It's just that one thing. Now look, what happens when you tell someone that there's this thing that they can't do? What does that more often than not make them want to do? It makes them want to do it. There's something kind of arbitrary in the sense that, according to this story, God creates just one thing that they can't do. It's not like there's like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 or 100 things they can't do. Just one. And why just one? Because one is all it takes. And if we buy the story of Genesis, then what we have to believe is that God created that tree. He created that rule, knowing that, of course, they were going to break it. Of course they would. Of course they would. And so the way that I read the story of Genesis is that evil was not a bug in the system. It was not something unexpected that popped up that ruined things. It was part of the design. And the point that I'm trying to make to you is not whether or not this story is right or whether or not we believe the book of Genesis or whatever. The point I'm trying to make to you is that if we look at some of these foundational religious or mythological explanations for the creation of the world, what we find is an emphasis on dichotomy, right? And what that tree in the book of Genesis, what that tree did was it represented, it's a metaphor for the split between two things. It is a metaphor for dichotomy, right? Because what it is God set up this paradise, but the tree is a kind of acknowledgement that you cannot have all of that good without evil or without the possibility of evil, right? So what I would argue is that it seems to be a kind of a law of the universe that, and I'm not talking about Christianity or the book of Genesis or anything now. I'm just talking about life. It seems to me that there is a kind of a law of the universe that it is necessary for evil to exist. It is necessary for something to have an opposite in order for that thing to exist. And if we believe that everything is one, the universe is one, or that it all came from a higher power or whatever, then good and evil are two sides of the same coin. Now, I'm not trying to say that, evil is great, and we should think it's great that there are, people doing horrible things out there or whatever. No. And I hope that as I get more into these philosophy videos, you'll see that that's not my view. But what I'm trying to point out is that it does seem like suffering and pain and these things are necessary components of creation, are necessary components of the universe. And if you think about, going back to Genesis, going back to that story, and what is the first thing that God does when he's creating? He says, and God said, "Let there be light." Now, that is the foundational, fundamental, initial act of creation, is the creation of light. And so if you think about what that represents, it represents the notion of dichotomy, because before there was light, everything was darkness, right? And that's what the book of Genesis says, right? There was darkness, and then what does God do when he creates light? He creates difference. He creates opposition. Now there are two. And what does he do when he creates people? He creates difference, opposition. Now there are two, man and female, right? Animals versus humans, another opposition, right? And so my point is, and some of you are probably like, why are you talking about the Bible so much? But I'm just saying that these creation mythologies, these creation stories, they have truth in them. And that is why people continue to read them and believe in them and all of that, right? And I think it's great. Again, I have a lot of respect for the Christian tradition, even though I no longer subscribe to it. Actually, when in early Christianity, there were certain sects of Christianity that actually tried to figure out and tried to reason why the world seemed so split between good and evil. And if you look at like the Gnostics or the Manichaeans, for instance, and so these were Christians. These were groups of Christians that had some kind of different, not so mainstream views on Christ and Christianity and stuff. But if you look, for instance, at the Gnostics or the Manichaeans, they were very interested in the notion that God was kind of bipolar in a way. I believe it was the Gnostics who believed that the Old Testament God was one God, and that Jesus basically came to rescue the world from this angry, mean Old Testament God. So like the Gnostics kind of saw God almost as a kind of a bipolar God, right? Where like, yeah, no, he, there's a lot of love and stuff, but then also you see, him like wiping out, whole groups of people. Like in the Old Testament, when he would tell the early Israelites to go and murder everyone that they found in this particular area, like go to your enemy's camp, and not only would God tell them to kill all, the men, but kill the women, kill the children, kill the animals. There's even some verses in the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, where God is instructing his people to wipe out another group of people to the point where they'll even kill their animals because God doesn't even want their animals hanging around. I mean, so yeah, there's some really disturbing stuff, right? And if you think about, and so what I'm trying to say is that even early Christians grappled with this quandary of how could a God of love also have set in motion all of this evil, and how could a God of love also be so frightening and terrifying, all right? Now, we're going to get away from the Christian thing and get back to looking at it from a philosophical perspective. That's a different thing there. And so we'll be talking about that in future episodes. And so, I don't want to, I want to leave this on a good note. I know I started out the film by crying, but, I do feel a little better having done this video. And that's one of the great things about making a video or talking to someone or getting therapy, right? A lot of people have this weird thing about therapy. They think that therapy is, that it's damaging, or that it just causes people to be self-obsessed and neurotic. And really what therapy is it's just a time for you to sit down with another person and reflect in a safe environment. And the reason that you do it with a therapist is because hopefully you can be yourself and say what you're really thinking and feeling, which unfortunately you can't do with most people in your life, as you know, right? So anyway, it does, I think it is helpful. Especially if you have a perceptive and insightful therapist that can take the things that you say and can help you work through them or help you think through them more. What's not good is a therapist who already has his or her concept of how things are, and they try to mold everything that you're saying into that, right? Like I had a therapist one time, and she was generally good, but she was really fixated on the idea that that basically all of your problems could be boiled down in a Freudian way to your parents. And a lot of the time I buy that. I actually do think that a lot of psychological issues that people have do boil down to stuff that unfortunate things that they were taught by their parents or raised with or whatever. But there were times when I would get frustrated with this woman, this therapist, because not everything had to go back to my dad, right? And so I would come in a lot very upset about death. I would say, it doesn't. Why am I supposed to care about any of this if I'm going to be dead in a number of decades anyway? What difference does any of it make if it's all going to go away, right? And she would say, you just feel that way because your dad, blah 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 blah. I used to hate that. But if you have a good therapist, that therapist will listen to what you're saying and will try to help you work through that, and not try to put you into little boxes, right, or automatically diagnose you or whatever. So what helps me? What has helped me through the years to deal with my depression, and what has helped me to deal with this fact, this reality that suffering and pain and disappointment and frustrated desire, these are major components of life. And I think that what has helped me is to look at the times in my life when I know that there was something deeper going on there in terms of deeper meaning and in terms of frankly, God's influence in my life. And what do I mean by that? Well, I can look back at my life and I can see that even during the really chaotic times, that there still seemed to be some kind of a force that was guiding me, some kind of a force or an intuition or a power that was guiding me through some of those things. And I can look back to times in my life when I was open to the universe and the universe seemed to reply. I have a number of these stories, some of them more interesting than others, but I'll tell you just one little story, okay? And And you can dismiss it if you want as coincidence, and it very well could be. I have a lot of stories like this, but I'm going to tell you this story. My grandfather, when he was dying years ago, I went to see him at the hospital before he died with my mom and my sister. And I had always had a really pretty strained relationship with my grandfather. Not strained in the sense that we argued or anything, but just that I felt very intimidated by him, and I felt unable to really talk to him or to really like have a relationship with him. He was a very gruff man. He was born and raised in a time and a place that was very alien to how I was born and raised, and he was very, like I said, gruff and cold, and he kind of scared me a little. He wasn't abusive or anything, but just kind of, And so anyway, I felt like I'd never really gotten to know him, and now he was dying. And we were there the whole day at the hospital. We were going to be there the whole day. And I had for weeks that I had known that he was going to die, I had this feeling in my heart that I really wanted to have a conversation with him, like a real conversation, before he died. And so I had this like burden, this feeling in my heart that I needed to have this conversation with him before he died. But I spent the whole day there at the hospital in the room with him. He was conscious most of the time and talking, awake and everything. I spent the whole day at the hospital, from that morning through the whole day, with my mom and my sister in his room, and I could not make myself start a conversation. I hugged him, and I sat there while my mom and sister and others kind of talked about trivial things or whatever, just to kind of, the things that people talk about, just to kind of fill the space. And this feeling that I had, that I need to talk to him, but it was like nobody else was having that kind of a conversation. I felt like maybe everybody else was kind of afraid to speak to or didn't want to, and it just wasn't happening. And so the day had wound down to a close, and it was early evening, and I'd not been able to do it. And my grandfather was kind of in worse shape toward the end of the day. It just didn't seem like it was going to happen, or that it even needed to happen. But I felt so burdened about this. Sometimes in life you just have these things on your heart, and you don't even know why, right? I was so burdened about this, and that I went to the chapel at the hospital, and I like I said, I wasn't a Christian at this point. I've been a theist for a long time. Since I left Christianity, I believed in God, but I didn't have any particular belief. But I wanted to say to whatever was out there. I wanted to ask whatever might be out there to show me if I needed to have this conversation, if I needed to suck it up and do it. So I got down on my knees in that chapel, in that empty hospital chapel, and I prayed. I said, I don't even know if you're out there, but I feel like I need to have this conversation with him, but I just can't do it. I'm scared. And I said to God, I said, I need something. I'm so scared or intimidated or whatever, and I don't even know if it's the right thing to do to bring up this stuff. So if I'm supposed to do this, if I need to have this conversation with him, I need a sign. I need him to ask me, do you have something to tell me? Like that's what I said to God in prayer. I said, I need to hear the words, do you have something to say to me? I need him to ask me, and then I'll know that I'm supposed to do it. So I got up, I went back to the room. My mom and my sister were already kind of sort of making moves to sort of get packed up to leave, kind of winding things down, wrapping things up. And we all knew that this was the last time that we would see him. He knew it too. And I think my sister had already said goodbye to him. Maybe my mom had too or whatever. And I was sitting down next to him. And all of a sudden, I remember what it was. He had just finished his meal. He was still kind of eating a little, and they'd given him food, and he had sat up to eat a bit. And I remember that I was just sitting there, and he looked at me, and he said, And he looked at me, he gave me this look that he had not given me before, really like fully like intentional, right? And he said, "Do you have something to say to me? Do you have something you need to say to me?" And I just knew that was the answer, because those were the exact words. Whatever came out of his mouth, it was the exact words that I had requested. And it was this was not, he had not asked my mom this or my sister this or anything. It was a very weird thing. It was a very eerie thing, because it seemed to come out of nowhere. And so I took a deep breath, and I don't even think that I could really get it out without crying, like right now. I think I was crying while I was saying it. And I just started talking. And I just started telling him all of these things that I wanted to tell him about how much I loved him, and I was sorry we hadn't had a better relationship, and all of that. And asking him questions about how he was feeling, how he was feeling inside, and about the fact that he was going to die soon or whatever, right? The stuff that I wanted to ask him, the stuff I wanted to say. And what came from that conversation was just the most amazing, transcendent experience of people in communion with each other, because he started talking. And then my mom started talking, really talking, right? Not just like bullshit, superficial stuff, but real talk. And he started talking, and my mom started talking, and my sister started talking, and we stayed there, I think, another couple of hours. I can't remember. We stayed there longer than we intended to, because we were all talking, and it was the best conversation that I ever had with him. And it was exactly the conversation that I had hoped to have before he died. Sorry for the runny nose. And I know that could just have been a coincidence. And there's nothing wrong with the view that was just a coincidence, right? I know there are people who would say, well, he knew that it was the last time he was going to see you. Maybe he looked at you, he could tell that you wanted to say something. It's just a coincidence. But my point is that I have had those types of things happen to me a lot in life. And what I have found is that, and I'm not trying to tell anybody that they need to believe in God or they need to have some particular religious belief or whatever. I'm just telling you what's worked for me. I have found that when I open myself up to the universe, and I ask the universe for meaningful things, not for a new car or whatever, but I ask the universe for meaningful things, or I ask the universe for insight or for guidance, I have found that it comes. And maybe not all the time, but it's happened enough. These types of things have happened enough that I do feel that there is something deeper going on, and I do feel that ultimately there is a greater meaning here to all of this than we can grasp. And there's a couple of things that I want to leave you with, philosophy-wise, because I know I didn't mean for this to turn into me just sharing about my life and crying, but whatever. But I'm trying to be real with you, okay? But there's a couple of things that Viktor Frankl says in his book, Man's Search for Meaning. This is the Holocaust guy. He says that when we think about the suffering we're going through and the suffering in the world, and it seems like it doesn't make any sense, and that therefore, how could there possibly be any deeper meaning to life? How could there possibly be a God or a reason or anything when there's just all of this suffering and pain and disappointment and bullshit and death? He said that it's important to think about the fact that we human beings are not the terminal point of evolution. We are not the end point of our species' evolution, and we are not the end point of the cosmos's evolution. And Frankl tells this story. He says that we should consider this example. Think about an ape, like a gorilla or a chimpanzee or something. Think about an ape in a lab, and that the ape is in a cage, and it's in this lab, and it's having some kind of cancer drug tested on it, all right? And so think about from the ape's perspective, right? All the ape knows is that every day it is in this cage, and that people will visit it and will stick it with these painful needles, and that's the ape's life. Now, Frankel says that we should understand that from the ape's perspective, from that gorilla's perspective, or from that chimpanzee's perspective, what it is going through in that laboratory, in that cage, being confined and being stuck repeatedly with these syringes, it makes no sense to that ape. It makes no sense to that gorilla, because that ape does not have the ability, it is not advanced enough, it is not evolved enough to understand the larger context of its suffering, of its situation. So all that it sees from its perspective is just a lot of random suffering and a random disappointment and frustration. And yet, if the ape were able to see, if we're able to comprehend it, then it would understand that while its situation sucks, it is that there is meaning in what it is doing. There is meaning in its suffering. All right? And Frankel says that our situation is not dissimilar. That while we, in a narcissistic sense, might think that we are so much more evolved than that ape, and we are the end point of evolution, and we are all that in fact, we are still extremely primitive, and in an evolutionary sense, and that we are part of a much larger evolution of the species and of the cosmos. And that just like the ape is unable, from its limited perspective, to grasp the meaning of its suffering, that we too, from our limited perspective, are unable to grasp the necessity for having suffering in this world, in this universe. Right? And Frankel says that what we should do, and he's saying this as a psychiatrist, right? This is a clinically trained psychiatrist. But what he is saying is that rather than saying, as so many people do, well, I don't understand this life, so there must be no point to it. Then instead, we should think of the ape, and we should understand that we should have faith that there is a meaning, but that it is one that is still largely inaccessible to us because we simply are still too primitive. We're too early in this process to grasp it. And Frankel says, is it not, and I'm quoting him here, he says, is it not conceivable that there is another dimension, a dimension beyond man's world, a dimension in which the suffering, contextualized, properly contextualized, would make sense? Right? And that, he says, is the challenge before us. We don't have to like suffering, right? This guy lost his family in a fucking concentration camp, all right? He spent a long time at Auschwitz thinking he was going to die, being tortured, suffering, all right? This guy has been through worse than probably anybody out there listening to me has. Maybe not everybody, okay? And if you've been through worse, I'm sorry. But generally speaking, this guy's been through the worst, okay? And yet, he says, look, yeah, it sucks. But to just say, it's all pointless, I give up, there's no meaning, that is a very intellectually, in some ways, a very intellectually limited, psychologically limited perspective. And so what he challenges us to do in his writing, what he challenges us to do in that book, is to have a kind of a faith that there is a larger context and meaning for our suffering. Now, you might say, what's with all this talk of God and everything? I thought you were going to talk to me about philosophy. Well, I am. And it's a shame that people have come to think of philosophy as necessarily excluding God, because that is not the case for a number of philosophers. And being a philosopher is not synonymous with being an atheist, okay? But I want to bring up one more person, and then I'm going to let us go for today. I want to talk a bit about something that you may have heard of before, Pascal. So Pascal, a really famous mathematician from several centuries ago, and also a famous philosopher. And Pascal had this idea that's come to be known as, it's called Pascal's wager, like a wager or a bet. And Pascal, when he wrote about this, he was writing about it in terms of Christianity because he was a Christian. But I think that we can expand it and think of it more generally in terms of the idea of like a higher power, whatever you would call a higher power, right? What you call it, God or the universe or whatever. And Pascal said that there are two ways of looking at life. Okay, one is to look at life as being connected to God. And to see and to recognize the existence of God and to recognize a higher meaning put in place by that God, okay, even if we don't understand it. And he says the other way is to not believe in God, is to have a perspective that there's no God, and there's no meaning, there's no larger reason, there's nothing, right? Now, Pascal said that both of these opinions are ultimately unprovable. In other words, no matter how much you might believe in God, there is no way that you can prove to anyone in an evidentiary sense, in an objective sense, that God exists. You can tell stories like the story that I just told earlier, maybe a very compelling story, right? Maybe very believable. But ultimately, there's no way that you can prove it, right? So too, though, neither can the atheist prove their perspective. There is no way that an atheist can prove that God does not exist. And so what Pascal said is that the belief in God and this kind of higher meaning is ultimately a wager. It is a bet. Because since we don't know one way or the other 100%, then your belief is simply a bet, right? And so for some of you, you may think that it's 90% likely that there is a God and 10% likely that there's not. Or some of you might think that it's 90% likely that there isn't, or 10% there is, and 50-50, whatever. The point is, it's a wager, it's a bet. It's never provable, it's never absolute. And Pascal said that what one should do is one should consider which bet or which wager is the more reasonable one. Which one is potentially the more profitable one? And he said that in order to determine that, one should consider the outcome of believing something incorrectly. In other words, this is what he says. If you believe in God, believe in some higher power or reason or meaning for life, and you die, and it turns out you were wrong, what have you lost, really? But if you don't believe in God or a higher power or higher meaning, and it turns out you were wrong, you have potentially missed out on a lot of the benefits that believing in a higher power would have given you, such as an ability to see beyond your pain and suffering, a faith that there is a larger reason, a sense that there is a higher power that cares about you, a sense that your life fits into some larger meaning or context, and perhaps even a sense that your life might go on afterward. I know that it's not considered intellectually fashionable to believe in an afterlife or a next life or something. But honestly, when you hear accounts of these near-death experiences that people have, where people are clinically brain dead, and yet they report having these transcendent, crystal clear, mystical experiences where they meet dead relatives, or they talk to God, and they learn all of these things. They have these life reviews where their life goes before them in an instant, and this higher power, this God, walks them through the events of their lives. I mean, have you ever read about these really profound experiences that some people have when they're near death and clinically brain dead? People who've almost drowned and been resuscitated, or had a heart attack and been resuscitated, and they report these things. Now, of course, I know that some people make them up. I know there's a lot of bullshit. Look, I go in here and I argue that Marilyn Manson is innocent, right? So I'm a skeptic, okay? I'm a skeptic of stories that people tell. But there's just too many of these near-death experiences, too many of these stories that people tell. And I do believe that there is something that survives after life, but I'll talk about that later. But my point is that Pascal, this philosopher and this mathematician who thought about life in a very precise mathematical way, he believed that a belief in God was anything but irrational. That in fact, given the fact that belief and non-belief are wagers because we don't know, that it actually made more sense for most people to believe, because it would give their lives a sense of purpose and meaning and stability and all of those things. And so I guess what I would say to you is that I'm not here today to tell you that you have to believe in God or whatever. But what I do want to do in this video, and in some of the future videos I'm going to do on this topic, is I want to look at different ways in which different philosophers and theologians and psychoanalysts have wrestled with the pain and suffering of life, and different approaches that they have found to confronting that and to dealing with that and to finding peace in life. And that's what I'm trying to do. That's what I've been trying to do, and it's what I will continue to do. And you know, some days are better than others, right? Today, not the best day, but I have to say I do feel a lot better now here at the end of this video after talking with you. So I thank you for that. I hope that you've gotten something out of this rambling video. I will try to make my next one better organized, maybe a little less crying and a little more organization. So we'll be looking at some different schools of thought in the next video, some different philosophies, a little more into some theology and religion, and into get into some psychoanalysis as well. All right, have a good day, and thank you.